She sat in that television studio for 11 minutes while her husband laughed into a live microphone and told 20 million viewers that she was his greatest charity case. That without him, she would have been nothing. That he had given her everything. The clothes on her back, the name she carried, the life she breathed. The audience laughed with him. The host smiled uncomfortably. And Serena Vale sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, and smiled the way a woman smiles when she has already won. She just hadn't shown him the scoreboard yet. Like this video. Comment your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The studio lights were too bright and the chair was too soft, and Serena had rehearsed this moment so many times in her head that the actual experience of living it felt almost slow, like watching a car accident from the sidewalk. Inevitable, frame by frame, impossible to look away from. She had worn the ivory dress on purpose. Clean lines. No jewelry except the simple gold band on her left hand that she had stopped touching 3 years ago. The stylist Dante's publicist assigned her had tried to push her towards something more dramatic, a deep burgundy statement earrings, the kind of look that said powerful woman beside powerful man. Serena had smiled and said no thank you and put on the ivory dress, and now she sat in the second chair on the set of the Harland Becker Hour while her husband held court 3 feet away, and she looked exactly like what she wanted to look like. She looked like furniture. Dante was in his element. He always was in front of cameras. 53 years old and still carrying the kind of physical presence that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. Broad shoulders, thick hands, the silver at his temples that his image consultants had specifically advised him to stop dyeing away because it made him look authoritative rather than vain. He laughed easily and leaned forward when he made a point and touched Harlan Becker's arm twice in the first 6 minutes, which was a dominance signal Serena had cataloged years ago without ever mentioning it to him. Dante touched people when he wanted them to feel chosen. It almost always worked. She had loved that about him once. The ease of him. The way he could walk into any room in the world and immediately become its center of gravity without appearing to try. She had been 24 when they met, and she had been brilliant and invisible, and he had walked into her orbit and made her feel seen in a way that she had confused, for longer than she would ever admit to anyone, with being loved. And of course Serena is here with us tonight, Harlan Becker said, pivoting toward her with the professionally warm smile of a man who interviewed celebrities for a living and had learned to make everyone feel like the most interesting person in the room, even when they clearly weren't. 12 years of marriage to arguably the most powerful private businessman in America. That can't be easy. It has its moments, Serena said. She smiled. The audience liked her. She could feel it in the particular quality of their attention, the way they leaned slightly forward, curious about this quiet woman in the ivory dress who barely spoke. People always wanted the quiet ones to eventually say something. She wasn't going to say anything tonight. Tonight was Dante's night. She had made sure of that, of what I always say, Dante cut in, smooth as always, not aggressive about it, just naturally redirecting the conversation back to its proper center, is that Serena has the easiest job in the world. She just has to exist. He grinned at her, and the grin was genuine and affectionate in that surface way of his. And Harlan Becker laughed, and several people in the studio audience laughed. And Serena held her smile and noted the precise way Dante's hand moved to her knee and rested there. A gesture that looked like warmth and functioned as a claim. I'm kidding. Mostly. Mostly, Harlan echoed, encouraging. Look, she's wonderful. She really is. But I'll be honest with you, Harlan, because that's what this show is about, right? Honesty? Dante shifted forward, elbows on knees, doing the thing he did when he wanted to appear candid. The performance of candor, which Serena had spent years studying like a second language. When I met her, she had nothing. I mean nothing. Brilliant girl. Absolutely brilliant. But no connections, no resources, no real path forward. And I took a chance on her. On us. And she became everything she is today because of that chance. He spread his hands, generous, magnanimous. I always say she's my greatest charity case. And I mean that in the most loving possible way. The audience laughed again. Harlan smiled and made a note on his card. Serena kept her expression exactly where she had placed it. Warm, vaguely amused, the expression of a woman who had heard this story before and found it harmless. She felt the 20 million people watching through the camera lens process what Dante had just said and accept it the way people accept things that seem plausible, things that fit the shape of the world as they understand it. Powerful man, grateful woman. A love story told from the only perspective the world had ever thought to ask for. She felt something settle in her chest, not hurt. She was past hurt, something more like the quiet click of a lock that had been waiting years for the right key. She thought, 4 more hours. Then she thought, be here, be present, be furniture a little longer. And she was. The rest of the interview passed the way most things passed for Serena lately. She was present and absent simultaneously, her face doing its job while the rest of her existed somewhere else, in the architecture of what was coming, in the precise sequence of steps she had spent 3 years arranging with the kind of obsessive patience that people who have never had to fight for their survival tend to mistake for passivity. Dante spoke about his investment portfolio, about the Moretti Group's expansion into Southeast Asian markets, about his philosophy of leadership, which involved a great deal of talking about discipline and vision and very little acknowledgement that the financial infrastructure underneath every single one of those achievements had been designed, built, and quietly controlled by the woman sitting 3 feet to his left, who he had just called a charity case on live television. When it was over and the cameras cut and the studio lights shifted to the cooler post-broadcast temperature, Dante stood and shook Harlan Becker's hand with both of his, and Harlan laughed at something Dante said, and a production assistant materialized to remove Serena's microphone pack, and Serena stood and smoothed the front of her dress and accepted Dante's arm when he offered it, and they walked out of the studio together, and it was all completely normal. In the car, Dante checked his phone. Good segment. Harlan's ratings have been soft lately. This'll help both of us. He scrolled through something. Marcus says the clip's already circulating, the charity case thing. He glanced up, briefly, checking her the way he sometimes checked the weather. A reflex, not a concern. You're not bothered by that. It wasn't a question. No, Serena said. He nodded and looked back at his phone, and that was the end of the conversation. The town car moved through Manhattan's Friday night traffic, and Serena watched the city slide past her window. The blur of lights and bodies and 10,000 private emergencies happening simultaneously across 10,000 lives. And she thought about the first time she had understood what she was dealing with. Not what Dante was. She had known what he was before she married him. She wasn't naive, had never been naive. That was possibly the least accurate word anyone had ever applied to her. She had understood the contours of the Moretti family business the way she understood most things, which was thoroughly, methodically, without flinching. What she had taken longer to understand was what she was to him. Not a partner, not even a prized possession exactly. Something more like a very useful component that he had incorporated into the machinery of his life, and then ceased to think about because it continued to function correctly. You stop noticing a foundation when it holds. That had been her great miscalculation, early on. She had believed that being essential would translate to being valued. She had been wrong about that with a precision that took her years to fully accept. She pulled out her own phone and opened a secure messaging application that Dante had never known existed and typed 3 words to a contact listed only as V. Confirm protocol status. The response came in under 30 seconds. All green, awaiting your signal. Serena locked the phone and looked back out the window and let herself feel, for just a moment, the things she had been careful not to feel for 3 years because feeling it too early would have made her impatient, and impatience would have made her careless. She let herself feel the clean, cold, absolute certainty of a woman who has been underestimated by the same person for 12 years and has spent the last 3 of them turning that underestimation into a weapon. Then she tucked it away and was furniture again. They had a dinner to attend. The dinner was at the Moretti Group's private dining room on the 43rd floor of their flagship hotel on Park Avenue. And it was the kind of dinner where the food was irrelevant and the conversation was everything and nobody in the room was entirely what they appeared to be. 16 people around an oval table, 3 of Dante's captains, 2 attorneys, 4 business associates of varying legitimacy, and a collection of spouses and partners who understood that their presence was atmospheric and conducted themselves accordingly. Serena sat at the opposite end of the table from Dante, which was protocol, and she listened and observed and made small talk with the woman to her left, whose husband ran a private logistics company out of Newark that moved things Serena had never asked about and Dante had never explained. She had stopped asking questions about the logistics companies years ago. She had simply made sure they were structured correctly. Across the table, once of Dante's attorneys, a man named Greaves, who wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent and had small, quick eyes that missed very little, caught Serena's gaze and held it for a half-second longer than was casual. Greaves had been with the Moretti organization for 9 years. He was one of 3 people in that room who knew, in precise detail, exactly what had been signed and structured and legally arranged over the course of the last decade. He was one of 2 people in that room who knew what was coming. He lifted his wine glass almost imperceptibly. Serena didn't return the gesture. She turned back to the woman beside her and asked about her daughter's school in Connecticut, and kept her face warm and interested and completely professionally blank. After dinner in the hotel corridor, while Dante was cornered by one of his captains discussing something that required lowered voices and turned backs, Serena slipped into the small alcove near the elevator bank and stood in the relative quiet with her back straight and her breathing deliberate. She had 4 hours. Less now. She had planned for 18 months before she activated the first phase. She had spent 3 years before that simply learning every structure, every ownership clause, every trust arrangement, every corporate charter that Dante had handed her to manage, because managing the details was beneath him, and she was available and competent, and, he had once said with genuine affection, had a mind like a filing cabinet. He had meant it as a compliment. She had taken it as an accurate description and acted accordingly. The Moretti Empire, by the time Serena had spent 7 years quietly restructuring it on Dante's instructions. Simplify this, move that, protect these assets from the next round of federal scrutiny, make sure the offshore arrangements are clean, was legally unrecognizable from what it had been when she married into it. More efficient, more protected, more sophisticated. Dante had been delighted. He had told her once, over a rare dinner at home when he was in an expansive mood and the bourbon was good, that she was the best thing that had ever happened to his balance sheet. He was right. He just didn't understand in which direction. Serena had not set out to do what she had done. That was the truth, and she held on to it because it mattered to her that it was true. She had not married Dante with a 20-year exit strategy. She had married him the way people marry when they are young and brilliant and lonely and in love with a version of a person that turns out to be only one room in a much larger and darker house. She had tried for years to find her way back to that room. She had tried conversation and patience and accommodation and the kind of strategic visibility that shouldn't have been necessary in a marriage, but was. She had tried for a long time. Then she had stopped trying and started planning. The planning had begun the night she sat across from Dante at their kitchen table. Their actual kitchen, in the private residence they kept in the penthouse above this very hotel, and presented him with a revised corporate structure for the Moretti Group's holding entities. A consolidation, she had called it. Cleaner lines of ownership, better asset protection, significantly improved legal insulation for the senior leadership. He had skimmed the documents for 4 minutes and signed where she indicated. He hadn't read a single clause. She had watched his pen move across the signature lines and felt something shift in her, quiet and tectonic, and had thought, well, there it is. What it was, specifically, was the moment she understood that Dante Moretti, feared by rivals, courted by senators, capable of destroying a man's career with a 20-second phone call, had signed over controlling interest in the majority of his most valuable holdings to his wife because she had told him it was a tax optimization strategy, and he had trusted her and not bothered to read the documents because the details were beneath him, and she was available and competent and had a mind like a filing cabinet. He hadn't known. For 7 years after that, he still hadn't known. And she had kept building. Oracle had been the masterpiece. She had developed the concept in the year after Dante's signing. Working with a small team of financial architects and data analysts, she had quietly assembled over 18 months. People who were brilliant and discreet and compensated at a level that ensured both qualities remained reliable. Oracle was not a single thing. It was a distributed intelligence network, a proprietary system of financial modeling and market prediction and asset management that operated across a constellation of independently incorporated companies, none of which were obviously connected to the others, and none of which appeared in any public document to have any relationship with the Moretti Group, or Dante Moretti, or anyone named Serena Vale. What Oracle had built, in the 7 years of its existence, was a fortune. Not a supplement to Dante's fortune. A separate fortune. A larger fortune. Serena had not touched it, had not spent $1 of it, had let it accumulate and compound and grow the way a patient person lets a garden grow, trusting the architecture and the time. It existed as a fact in the world, documented in private ledgers and encrypted servers that only she and a handful of people she would trust with her life could access. And it was hers in a way that nothing in her marriage had ever been hers. And she kept it separate from everything else, the way you keep a match separate from gasoline until the moment you decide it's time. She checked her watch in the alcove outside the elevator bank. 3 hours and 40 minutes. She heard Dante's laugh from down the corridor. The big, rolling laugh he deployed when he wanted someone to feel forgiven for something. And she straightened her shoulders and walked back toward the dining room. Later, after the dinner concluded, and the goodbyes were said, and the car service had been arranged, and the last of the guests had dispersed into the elevator banks with their coats and their conversations still trailing behind them, Dante stood in the corridor with his jacket slung over one arm and his tie loosened and looked at Serena with the slightly unfocused attention of a man who has had 3 bourbons and considers the evening a success. "You were quiet tonight," he said. "I'm always quiet." "Quieter than usual." He studied her for a moment, doing the quick calculation she had seen him do 1,000 times, assessing a situation for threat value, finding none, moving on. "You're not still in your head about the Becker thing." "I told you I wasn't." "Because it landed well. The clip has 4 million views already. Marcus says it's playing as charming." "I know. And you look great, by the way. The dress was right." He said it the way he said most things to her, says, accurately, without warmth, the way you comment on a decision that worked out. "Get some sleep. I've got the Brennan call at 7. He moved toward the elevator. Serena watched him go and noted, with clinical precision, that she felt nothing. Not grief, not satisfaction, not the hot, messy tangle of feelings she had spent years expecting to feel in this moment. Just a clean, clear, quiet sense of forward motion, like the first movement of a machine that has been very carefully assembled and is now, finally, being switched on. She waited until the elevator doors closed. Then she took out her phone and opened the secure messaging application and typed 2 words to V. "Execute Icarus." The response was immediate. "Confirmed. Clock starts now." Serena put the phone away and stood alone in the corridor of the 43rd floor with the city humming 43 stories below her and everything she had built quietly and everything she was about to become openly and the strange specific piece of a woman who has been waiting a very long time and is done waiting now. She pressed the elevator button. She rode down to the lobby. She walked through the front doors of the Moretti Hotel on Park Avenue for what she knew would be the last time as anyone's wife, stepped into the cool October air, and got into the car that was waiting for her. Not the town car that Dante's driver managed, but a different car arranged by a different person, part of a different infrastructure entirely. The driver didn't speak. She hadn't asked him to. She leaned back against the seat and watched Manhattan slide past and let herself breathe, fully, for the first time in years. In 6 hours, the first wave would hit. In 12, Dante Moretti's empire would begin to understand that something was wrong. In 24, the most feared man in New York would pick up his phone to call his most trusted financial officer and discover that the number had been transferred. To her. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, because even the most carefully constructed plan has the variables it doesn't account for, was that one of the 16 people at that dinner table had already made a phone call of his own, and that the call had gone to someone who was not an ally of Dante Moretti's, but was not, as it turned out, a neutral party either. What she didn't know was that she wasn't the only person who had been watching Dante Moretti and waiting for exactly the right moment, and that the second player had just learned that the clock had started. The first thing that broke was the Singapore account. It happened at 4:17 in the morning, New York time, and the man who discovered it was a junior financial officer named Teo Kwan, who worked night shifts out of the Moretti Group's Midtown Operations Center, and who would later describe the experience to his wife as feeling like watching the floor of a building dissolve from the edges inward. One moment the numbers were there, familiar, stable, the kind of numbers you stop really seeing after you've stared at them long enough. And then a transfer authorization moved through the system with Serena Vale Moretti's digital signature, and the account balance became zero, and the authorization trail led to a holding company Teo had never heard of. And when he tried to pull the corporate registration on that holding company, he found 17 layers of legitimate documentation that told him absolutely nothing useful, and by the time he reached for his phone to call his supervisor, his hands were shaking. His supervisor called Marcus Hale. Marcus Hale was Dante Moretti's chief of operations, which was the legitimate title for a job that involved knowing where every dollar was at all times and making sure the people who needed to not know things didn't know them. He was 51, built like someone who had been athletic 20 years ago and had since redistributed, and he had worked for Dante for 14 years because Dante paid generously and Marcus had a talent for operational loyalty that bordered on the pathological. He was also, at 4:23 in the morning, standing in his kitchen in Westchester in his undershirt staring at his phone with an expression that his wife, watching from the doorway, would later describe as the face of a man who has just understood a joke that isn't funny. "Pull the Singapore records back 12 months, he said into the phone. "All of them. Don't touch anything else. Don't call anyone else. I'll be there in 40 minutes. He got there in 32. By the time Marcus walked into the operations center, Teo Kwan had found 3 more accounts. Not emptied, restructured, transferred to holding entities with clean paper trails and zero obvious connection to anything Marcus recognized. Whoever had built the architecture behind these transfers had built it slowly, over years, in layers so thin that any single layer looked like routine corporate housekeeping. You had to pull back far enough to see the shape of the whole thing, and when Marcus finally pulled back far enough, standing over Teo's shoulder at 5:08 in the morning with a coffee going cold in his hand, he felt the particular nausea of a man who has been in the room with something dangerous for a very long time without knowing it was there. "How many accounts?" he asked. "That I've confirmed so far?" 11. Teo's voice was careful, the voice of someone delivering news in a minefield. "But the structure?" "Marcus, the structure goes a lot deeper than 11 accounts. These are just the ones that moved last night. The ownership transfers. Some of these look like they go back 7 years. Marcus set down the coffee. "Get me everything. Every entity, every transfer, every signature. I want it on my desk in 2 hours. "It's going to take longer than 2 hours, Teo." He went to his office and closed the door and stood with his back against it and did something he almost never did, which was allow himself to feel afraid. Not the manageable operational fear of a problem that needs solving. Something older and more physical, a fear that lived in the body before the brain could process it. Because Marcus had spent 14 years watching Dante Moretti dismantle people who crossed him, and what he was looking at right now was not a financial irregularity or an outside attack or a competitor making a move. What he was looking at had Serena Vale Moretti's signature on every single document. He picked up his phone and called the one number he should not have called first, but called anyway because 14 years of working for a man creates habits that override protocol. And when the line connected and Dante answered on the 3rd ring with the rough, alert voice of someone who sleeps light, Marcus said, "We have a problem. Silence on the line." The specific silence of Dante Moretti processing information. Marcus knew that silence well, had navigated it hundreds of times, but this particular version of it had a different quality. Heavier, longer. "How big?" Dante said. It wasn't a question. "I don't have the full picture yet, but what I have." "Dante, you need to come in. Now, tonight." Another silence. "Is it external?" Marcus closed his eyes. "No." He heard Dante breathe. "I'll be there in an hour." He was there in 45 minutes. He arrived without a tie, which Marcus had seen exactly twice in 14 years. And he walked into the operations center with the controlled, deliberate movement of a man keeping something caged behind his ribs. And he stood over Teo Kwan's workstation and looked at the screens for a long time without speaking. The operations center had a particular nighttime quality. Low light, the hum of servers, the kind of quiet that accumulates in rooms where people are afraid to make noise. And nobody spoke while Dante looked. Then he said, "Show me the signatures." Teo pulled them up. Document after document, the clean digital signature of Serena Vale Moretti, time-stamped across 7 years of transactions that had each, individually, looked like ordinary corporate management. Dante leaned in close to the screen. His jaw was set. A vein at his temple that Marcus had learned to watch in high-stress situations was visible. "These are real," Dante said. "Yes," Marcus said. "She signed these." "Yes." Dante straightened up and turned away from the screen and walked to the window that looked out over the midtown skyline, still dark at this hour, the city doing the slow work of becoming morning. He stood there for a while. Nobody in the room moved. "Get me Greaves," he said finally. Marcus felt something cold move through him. "It's 5 in the morning. I know what time it is. Get me Greaves." Marcus dialed. The phone rang 7 times before a voice answered. Alert, unsurprised, which was itself a small piece of information that Marcus's brain filed away in the part of itself that was still functioning analytically, even while the rest of him was following the situation off a cliff. "I've been expecting this call," Greaves said. The room went very still. Dante turned from the window. "Put him on speaker." Marcus did. "Greaves." Dante's voice had dropped to the register it went to when he was working very hard to sound calm. "Explain to me what I'm looking at." A pause on the line. The kind of pause that contains a decision. "What you're looking at," Greaves said, "is the result of 7 years of legally structured asset transfers, all properly documented, all authorized by signatures that were obtained correctly and will hold up in any court in any jurisdiction you'd like to try." Another pause. "I'd recommend against trying." The vein at Dante's temple was very visible now. "You built this," Dante said. "I structured it. The architecture was Serena's." "You work for me." "I work for the Moretti Group," Greaves said, and something in his voice shifted, just slightly, the way a door shifts when the lock engages. "As of approximately 11 hours ago, the majority controlling interest in the Moretti Group's primary holding entities belongs to Serena Vale. I work for her." Dante moved. Fast, for a big man. He crossed the operations center in 4 strides and grabbed the phone out of Marcus's hand and took it off speaker and pressed it to his ear and said something low and specific that Marcus couldn't fully hear. And whatever he said, Greaves responded to with a single sentence that Marcus caught only the tail end of. "Suggest you speak to her directly. She's available. She told me to tell you she would be." Dante ended the call. He stood very still. Then he threw the phone. Not at anyone, not at anything specific, just threw it, a release of something that had nowhere else to go, and it hit the far wall and the screen cracked, and the room absorbed the sound and went quiet again. "Get her on the phone," he said to Marcus. "Dante, get her on the phone." Marcus tried. The number he had for Serena, the number he had used 100 times to coordinate logistics and schedules and the small administrative machinery of the Moretti household, rang 4 times and transferred to a voicemail that identified itself only by number, no name, no personalization. He tried twice more. The same result. He tried the penthouse. The building's front desk picked up, and a polite night manager explained that Mrs. Moretti had checked out of the residence at approximately 2 in the morning and had arranged for the removal of several personal items. They had assumed this was expected. Was there anything else they could assist with? Dante stood in the middle of the operations center, and Marcus watched him do the thing that Marcus had never seen him do in 14 years. He stood still and simply did not know what to do next. It lasted maybe 8 seconds. Then something locked back into place behind his eyes, and he said, "Call Costa, call Reyes, call every captain and tell them to hold their positions until I give the word. Nobody moves money, nobody moves anything, until I know what's still ours." "What is still ours?" Teo asked quietly from his workstation. Dante looked at him. It was not a kind look, but it was, Marcus thought, at least an honest one. "That," Dante said, "is what we're going to find out." What they found out over the next 4 hours was considerably worse than anything Marcus had modeled in the worst version of his imagination. Costa called in from his position at 718 and reported that the logistics network, 3 shell companies that moved product through Newark and Baltimore, had been transferred to a holding entity out of the Cayman Islands that their contacts at the Port Authority didn't recognize and couldn't find information on. Reyes called at 7:44 and said 2 of the casino properties in Atlantic City had been placed under a management restructuring agreement overnight, legal, binding, signed by Serena as a co-director of the relevant corporations. A real estate contact in Miami called Marcus directly at 8:02 and said he'd received notification that 3 of the Moretti adjacent development projects were under new ownership, And could Marcus confirm whether this was intentional? Marcus could not confirm that. At 8:30, Dante gathered his senior people in the hotel conference room, not the 43rd floor private dining room, which apparently was no longer theirs in any operational sense, but a standard conference room on the 22nd floor that belonged to the hotel's legitimate hospitality business. 7 men around a table, some of them understanding more than others about the scope of what they were facing, all of them wearing the particular expression of people who have operated for years in a system that functioned because it was controlled and are now encountering, for the first time, the experience of not being in control. Dante sat at the head of the table and didn't speak for the first 2 minutes after everyone arrived. He was looking at a document Marcus had printed, a summary of what Teo and the overnight team had been able to map in the past 4 hours. The summary was 7 pages long. The number of assets that remained cleanly and unambiguously in Dante's sole control occupied the bottom third of the last page. She did this over 7 years, Dante said. He wasn't speaking to anyone specific. He was speaking the way people sometimes speak when they are trying to make a fact feel real by saying it out loud. 7 years. The signatures check out, said one of the attorneys who had been pulled from sleep and arrived looking like it. Every transfer, every restructuring, they were all properly authorized. Some of them you signed yourself. I signed what she put in front of me. Yes. A pause. That's not a legal defense. Dante's eyes moved to the attorney with a flatness that made the man look briefly at the table. I know what it is, Dante said. Marco, one of the captains, older than the others, 50s, the kind of weathered that comes from having been in the room when things went badly before, spoke from the far end of the table. His voice was even, careful. What does she want? Nobody's talked to her, Marcus said. Nobody's talked to her. Marco sat forward. She's running a play that took 7 years to execute, and nobody's talked to her? We're sitting here looking at our own financials like tourists, and we haven't even called her? She's not picking up. Then go to wherever she is. Marco looked at Dante. You know where she is. The table went quiet. Everyone looked at Dante. And Marcus watched something move across Dante Moretti's face that he had never seen there before. Not fear, exactly. Not the operational fear of a solvable problem. Something deeper and less manageable. The specific corrosive humiliation of a man who has just understood that the person he knew least was the person sitting beside him for 12 years. I don't, Dante said. You don't know where your own wife is. I don't know where she is, Dante repeated, and each word had a flat, precise weight to it. I don't know where she's been. I don't know who she's been talking to, and I don't— He stopped, put both hands flat on the table. I don't know how much of what I thought I owned was ever actually mine. The silence that followed was the kind that fills itself. Marco looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at his hands. It was Teo, who had no business being in this meeting but had followed Marcus in because no one had thought to tell him not to, who broke it, from his position against the back wall where he'd been standing with a laptop open, doing what he did, which was finding things. I've got a location, he said. Everyone turned. Teo looked at his screen, then at Dante, with the expression of someone who is not sure whether delivering good news is actually good. She called in a building access code at 6:15 this morning, one of the properties in the financial district. He hesitated, the one that houses the server infrastructure for the communications network. Marcus felt the cold thing move through him again. The communications network was the backbone of everything the Moretti operation ran on. Encrypted messaging, financial transfers, operational coordination. It was the system Serena had rebuilt for them 4 years ago, after the old one was compromised. She had designed it. She had implemented it. She had told Dante it was the most secure private communications infrastructure in the city, and Dante had been pleased, and had told people about it at dinners, and had never, not once, looked closely at who owned the servers. She's at the server facility, Dante said. Yes. Dante stood up. We're going, he said to Marcus. Dante, now. The building in the financial district was a converted industrial space that looked, from the outside, like a dozen other converted industrial spaces. No signage, no identifying features, a door that required a keycard and a code, and a secondary authentication that Dante realized as Marcus was punching in the sequence beside the entrance. He had never personally performed, because he had never needed to come here, because this was one of those pieces of infrastructure that simply existed and functioned, and he had not needed to think about it. The door opened. They went up 2 flights of stairs and a stairwell that smelled like concrete and recycled air, and emerged into a large open floor of servers and cooling systems, and the specific low electronic hum of a room that processes enormous amounts of information continuously. Banks of equipment stretched back into the low light. 3 people were working at stations along the near wall. People Marcus didn't recognize, which meant people Serena had brought, which meant the facility was already under different management in a practical sense, even if the paperwork was still catching up. And at the far end of the room, standing at a central workstation with a tablet in one hand and speaking quietly to a woman beside her, was Serena. She was wearing different clothes than last night. Dark trousers, a simple gray top, her hair pulled back. She looked like someone who had been working for several hours and was not particularly tired. She looked, Marcus thought, more like herself than he had ever seen her look, which was a strange thought, given that he had worked alongside her for a decade, and it took him a moment to understand what he meant by it. She looked like someone who had stopped performing a different version of herself. She looked up when they walked in. Her expression was calm, not the performed calm of the woman in the television studio last night, something quieter and more settled. Dante crossed the floor in long strides and stopped 6 feet from her and said, "What have you done?" Not a question, something more raw than that. Serena looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "What needed to be done about 7 years ago? This is theft." "It's really not." She set the tablet down on the workstation. "Everything was transferred legally. Everything was authorized. You signed, Dante. Multiple times, across multiple years." A pause. "You just didn't read anything. You used me." Something crossed her face. Brief. Complicated. "That's an interesting complaint," she said, "from a man who told 20 million people last night that I owe him my existence." The room was very still. The servers hummed. The 3 technicians had very carefully stopped looking in the direction of the conversation. Dante took 1 step closer. Marcus moved half a step forward by reflex, then stopped. "I will take this to court," Dante said. "Every signature, every transfer. I will tie this up in litigation for 10 years, and you will not see a dollar." "You can try." Serena's voice didn't change. "But you'd be litigating against yourself, in a manner of speaking. Most of what I control is structured through entities you co-founded. You would be arguing in court that your own organizational decisions were fraudulent, which would open a great many additional questions about those organizations that I suspect you would prefer remain closed." She paused. "I have very good attorneys. Greaves, among others." Dante stared at her. The vein at his temple was back. His hands, Marcus noted, were loose at his sides, deliberately loose. The controlled stillness of a man who is managing something. 12 years, he said. "Yes." "And this is what you—" "Dante." Her voice shifted slightly. Not soft, just direct. "You called me a charity case on live television, but you knew, on some level you've always known, that without the structure I built, your empire runs for about 18 months before the federal investigations find the gaps I closed for you." She let that settle. "I didn't take anything from you. I protected it. And then when I was done, I moved it. That's not a justification." "I'm not justifying it," Serena said. "I'm explaining it. There's a difference." Dante looked at her for a long time. Marcus couldn't read his face. That almost never happened. Then Dante said, in a voice stripped of almost everything, "What do you want?" And Serena opened her mouth to answer. And before she could, the door at the top of the stairwell opened and 3 people walked in who were not any of theirs. Not Dante's people, not Serena's, no one Marcus recognized at all. And the woman at the front of the group, mid-40s, gray suit, the specific flat authority of someone who operated in spaces where authority didn't need to announce itself, looked at the room and said, "Nobody leaves, and nobody touches anything on those servers." She held up a badge. Federal. Marcus felt the floor shift the way Teo Kwan had described, edges dissolving inward. And in that moment, in the hum and the low light of a server room in the financial district, Dante Moretti turned and looked at Serena Vale with an expression that Marcus Hale would remember for the rest of his life. And what he saw there was not rage. It was the look of a man who has just understood, fully and finally, that he is not the most dangerous person in the room, and never had ever been. The federal agent's name was Diane Cho, and she moved through the server room the way people move when they have practiced this exact sequence of steps many times and are no longer nervous about any of it. Two agents flanked her, both younger, both with the contained physical readiness of people trained to manage situations that could go sideways, and they fanned out without being told to, positioning themselves near the exits in a way that communicated clearly that the exits were no longer available as a casual option. Serena stood very still. This was not in the sequence. She ran the calculation fast, the way she always ran calculations, stripping the situation to its structural components before allowing herself any reaction, and what she got back was wrong. Not wrong like an error. Wrong like a variable she hadn't known existed. Cho was federal. The badge was Financial Crimes Enforcement, which meant this was not a raid on the Moretti organization. That kind of operation would have been larger, louder, would have come through the front and brought more bodies. This was targeted, specific. This was someone who knew exactly where to come and had waited for exactly the right moment, which meant someone had told them. Ms. Vale, Cho said, and her use of that name rather than Mrs. Moretti was itself a piece of information. This woman had done her homework, knew the legal structure, knew who she was talking to. We have a warrant for the servers in this facility. We'd like this to go smoothly. On what grounds? Serena said. Her voice came out level. She was grateful for that. Financial fraud, specifically the fraudulent structuring of assets to impede federal investigation into the Moretti Group. Cho held out the warrant, a physical document, paper, the kind of thing that meant someone had gone to a judge, which meant this had been building for longer than last night. We've been watching this facility for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Serena took the warrant and read it, and she read it the way she read everything, completely and fast. And what she found in it was specific enough to confirm the thing her mind had already started constructing. The warrant referenced Oracle. Not by that name, thought, by the corporate entities underneath it, 3 of them, named precisely, with incorporation dates and registration jurisdictions that were not public knowledge. Information that existed in exactly 4 places: her private records, her attorney's files, the servers in this room, and the memories of the people she had trusted to build it with her. She looked up from the warrant. Across the room, Dante was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately read, and beside him Marcus Hale had the look of a man encountering a situation that has exceeded his operational categories. Neither of them had known the agents were coming. She was certain of that. Dante's surprise had been real, and Marcus didn't perform surprise. He was too controlled for it, which left the other variable. You're going to want to step away from the central workstation, Cho said, not unkindly. And I'm going to need everyone's phones. Serena set the warrant down on the workstation. She stepped away from it. She handed over her phone with the specific care of someone placing an object in a location where it will be found exactly as left, which was not compliance so much as a statement. The agent who took it wore gloves. They bagged it. They were thorough. Dante surrendered his phone without being asked. He was looking at Serena. She could feel it without looking back. Then Cho said, Ms. Vale, I'd like to speak with you separately. There's a room downstairs we can use. Am I being detained? Not at this moment, I'm asking. A pause. The servers hummed. One of the technicians Serena had brought was sitting very still at her station with her hands flat on the desk, not touching anything, which was exactly the right instinct, and Serena had hired her partly for that quality. All right, Serena said. The room downstairs was a small operations office. Desk, 3 chairs, a window that looked at a concrete wall. Cho sat across from Serena and opened a slim folder and for a moment didn't say anything, just looked at the contents of the folder with the practiced blankness of someone who has done interrogations and knows that silence is a tool. Serena waited. She was good at waiting. Oracle, Cho said. I don't know what that is. Ms. Vale. Cho's voice was patient. We have corporate registration documents, financial filings, server access logs, and 14 months of transaction records tied to the entities underneath what your internal communications refer to as Oracle. We have emails. She paused. We have a cooperating witness. There it was. Serena kept her face where it was. It cost her something. Who? She said. Cho looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I think you already know. And Serena did know, was already knowing it in the way you know something that your brain has been circling for hours without landing on, because landing on it meant accepting it. And she had not accepted it because accepting it required believing that the one piece of the structure she had been most certain of was the piece that had failed. Not Greaves. Greaves was too self-interested for betrayal. He would only turn if turning served him, and nothing about his position made turning rational. Not V, her primary operations contact. V had too much of his own exposure in the structure to survive cooperation with federal investigators without destroying himself, which left the architect, which left Elena Voss. Elena Voss had been the first person Serena recruited to build Oracle, a financial architect, technically a data systems engineer, but what she actually did was design the logic underneath financial structures, the invisible skeleton that determined how money moved and where it rested, and how it appeared to the outside world. Serena had found her through a network of contacts so carefully assembled and so deliberately unconnected to the Moretti world that Elena had never known, in the beginning, whose money she was working with. By the time Elena knew, she was 3 years into the construction, and her own fingerprints were on everything. That had been a form of protection. Serena had understood it as mutual insurance. She had been wrong about that. I'd like to know, Serena said carefully, the scope of what your witness has provided. Enough, Cho said. That's not specific. No. Cho folded her hands on the folder. Ms. Vale, I want to be direct with you because I think you're someone who responds better to directness than to the other approach. The entities underneath Oracle were used to move assets that are subject to federal forfeiture as proceeds of organized crime. Now, you may argue, and you will argue, because I've read enough about you to know you have an excellent legal team, that you structured those entities to isolate legitimate holdings from criminal exposure. And that may even be partly true. But the problem is that the money that seeded Oracle in the first place came through accounts that are now part of a federal investigation into the Moretti Group, which means everything built on that foundation is tainted. She let that land. Including the independent fortune you spent 7 years constructing. The room was very quiet. Serena felt something happen in her chest that she did not have a clean name for. Not panic, something more structural. The sensation of a load-bearing element shifting. She had built Oracle to be separate. She had been meticulous about the separation. The seed capital had been clean. She had cleaned it herself, had run it through 4 legitimate investment vehicles before it ever touched an Oracle entity, had specifically designed the architecture to create legal distance from the Moretti money. Elena had known how the seed capital was structured. Elena had provided the architectural logic for the separation. If Elena had told the federal investigators not just what Oracle was, but how the money moved at its foundation, if she had reframed the legitimate structuring as deliberate obfuscation, then the argument Cho was making was not insane. It was wrong, but it was not insane, and wrong and insane were 2 very different things in a federal courtroom. You're telling me, Serena said, that the cooperation of your witness has allowed you to recharacterize legitimate financial separation as criminal structuring. I'm telling you that we have a witness who built the system and is willing to testify about intent. Cho's voice didn't change. Intent is difficult to counter when the person describing it was in the room. Serena looked at the concrete wall through the window. She thought about Elena Voss, 42 years old, originally from Stuttgart, 2 children in a school in New Jersey, a woman who had taken the Oracle work partly out of intellectual fascination, and partly because the compensation had been extraordinary, and partly, Serena had always believed, because she shared something with Serena, some quality of ambition that had been built in the shadow of other people's assumptions. They had worked together for 4 years, and Serena had trusted her with the most important thing she had ever built, and Elena had apparently decided, at some point in the past 6 weeks, that cooperation was the better survival strategy. Serena understood that calculation. She did not forgive it. What are you offering? She said. Cho opened the folder. That depends on what you can provide. I'm not testifying against Dante Moretti. That's not what I'm asking for. Serena looked at her. The Moretti Group is one investigation, Cho said. Oracle is a separate matter, and frankly, it's the one I'm actually here about. Oracle moved money across 12 jurisdictions over 7 years. Some of that money has nothing to do with the Moretti family. It has to do with other organizations that use the Oracle infrastructure as a transit system. She paused. Organizations that your witness can only partially identify, because she built the pipes, but you controlled who used them. Serena was very still. This was the piece she had not seen coming. Oracle had been built as a closed system. Serena's assets, Serena's management, controlled access. But in the third year, she had made a decision she had characterized to herself as pragmatic. There were other parties, other individuals with assets that needed sophisticated management, legitimate high-net-worth clients who had come to her through channels she trusted. And she had allowed a small number of them access to Oracle's infrastructure on a fee basis. She had vetted them. She had believed she had vetted them thoroughly. She was now understanding that her vetting had been insufficient in at least one direction. "You have names," Serena said. It wasn't a question. "We have partial transaction records. We need the rest of the picture." Cho leaned slightly forward. "Ms. Vale, the assets you built independently, Oracle's core holdings, can potentially be separated from the criminal taint argument if you can demonstrate that the parties using the infrastructure without your knowledge introduced the contamination. That requires you to give us what you know about those parties. And if I do that, then the forfeiture argument becomes significantly harder to sustain. Your attorneys will still have a fight, but it will be a fight you can win." A pause. "Without that cooperation, I'm not optimistic about what survives." Serena put both hands flat on the desk in front of her and looked at them. The left hand still had the gold band on it. She hadn't taken it off yet, had been carrying that as a future action, something to be done at the right moment. She looked at it now and felt the specific absurdity of the detail. Everything else dismantled, everything else in motion, and she was still wearing his ring. She took it off, set it on the desk between herself and Cho. Cho looked at it and said nothing. "I need to speak with my attorneys before I agree to anything," Serena said. "Of course. And I need full documentation of what your witness has provided. Every statement, every exhibit. I need to see exactly what was said and how it was framed before I can give you an accurate account of anything." "That's a reasonable request. Some of it we can provide." "All of it," Serena said, "or this conversation is over and you can speak to Greaves." Cho considered her for a moment. The flat professional expression shifted, barely, towards something that might have been respect, or might have been the recognition of a particular kind of opponent. "I'll see what I can do," she said. They went back upstairs. The server room was controlled chaos, agents cataloging equipment, technicians sitting against the wall being interviewed individually by a second team, the careful, systematic dismantling of 7 years of infrastructure proceeding with federal efficiency. Serena stood in the doorway and watched, and did not let herself feel what she was feeling, which was vast and structural and needed to wait. Dante was sitting in a chair against the far wall. Sitting, which surprised her. She would have expected him to be standing, performing defiance for whoever was watching. But he was sitting, his elbows on his knees, looking at the floor. And he looked, for the first time in 12 years, like a man who is tired. Marcus stood nearby. When Serena entered, Marcus looked at her, and she could see him recalculating, taking in the conference room and the warrant and her face, and running his own analysis. He was sharp enough to see most of it. She walked across the room and stopped near Dante. He looked up. Up close, she could see the exhaustion. Not just the 5 a.m. exhaustion of a bad night, but something underneath it. The kind of tired that comes from a long time of running something heavy. "They have Oracle," she said quietly, "for him only." He stared at her. "Someone inside built a cooperation agreement with federal financial crimes. They're arguing the Oracle entities are tainted by Moretti money at the foundation." She kept her voice flat. "They want the names of third parties who use the infrastructure." "And what do they want from me?" Dante said, his voice rough. "Nothing you haven't already given them." She paused. "The investigation into the Moretti group is separate. This is about Oracle. This is about what I built." He was quiet for a moment. "So they got you," he said. "Someone helped them find the angle." "Who?" Elena Voss. She watched him process the name, watched him place it. He knew Elena by a different name, knew her as a technology contractor Serena had used, had never known the scope of her involvement. "One of yours," he said. "Yes." Something moved in Dante's expression. It wasn't satisfaction. She would have understood satisfaction, even found it fair. It was more complicated than that, more human. All of it, he said. Everything you built. Not everything. She said it with a precision that surprised even herself. If I can counter the taint argument, if I can demonstrate clean separation. Can you? She didn't answer immediately. She was honest enough not to answer immediately. I don't know yet, she said. Dante looked at her for a long time. The server room hummed around them, full of federal agents and the systematic dismantling of everything. And outside the sun was coming up over the financial district, the city accelerating into its ordinary morning, and for a moment, just a moment, they were two people sitting with the wreckage of 12 years and the strange, specific grief of ending. Then Dante said, "You should have left 5 years ago." She looked at him. "Before any of this," he said. "You should have just left." "I tried," Serena said. "You weren't the kind of thing you could just leave." He nodded. Once. Slowly. Like a man accepting a debt he knew he owed. Then Cho's second agent appeared at Serena's elbow and said they needed her to come back downstairs, and Serena straightened and turned away from Dante Moretti for what felt, though she couldn't be certain yet, like the last time she would ever speak to him as anything other than an opposing party in a legal proceeding. She went downstairs. In the small office with the concrete wall, she sat down and pulled a yellow legal pad from the desk drawer and a pen from her jacket pocket, and she wrote, in her careful handwriting, the names of the 3 third parties who had used Oracle's infrastructure in year 3 and 4, and who she had not, as it turned out, vetted with sufficient thoroughness. She wrote the names and looked at them. These were not small names. These were names that would create consequences, not just legal consequences, not just the kind of fallout that federal cooperation produces, but the kind of consequences that move through networks of dangerous people and arrive without warning and do not announce themselves before. She wrote the names and looked at them. These were not small names. These were names that would create consequences, not just legal consequences, not just the kind of fallout that federal cooperation produces, but the kind of consequences that move through networks of dangerous people and arrive without warning. And Serena had known that when she wrote them down, had accepted it the way you accept the cost of a decision you cannot afford not to make. She had handed the list to Cho at 9:47 in the morning. By noon, one of those names had already heard about it. She didn't know that yet when she walked out of the financial district building into the hard October sunlight with Greaves beside her, and a federal preservation order on the Oracle servers, and a legal situation that was still, technically, survivable, damaged, bleeding, reorganized around a new center of gravity, but survivable. Greaves was on his phone before they reached the sidewalk, talking to the litigation team, his voice the precise controlled instrument of a man who manages crisis the way other people manage appointments. Serena walked beside him and let the city noise fill in around her and breathed the cold air and took inventory. Oracle's core holdings, the accumulated 7 years of independent wealth, were frozen pending the federal review. Not seized. Frozen. That distinction mattered. Cho had been honest about the scope of what cooperation could achieve, and what it could achieve was a viable legal argument for separation, which meant the freeze was a delay, not a death sentence. The third-party contamination was the problem. The 3 names she had written down, one financial intermediary operating out of Geneva, one private equity structure with roots in Cyprus, and one name she had needed 2 minutes to write because writing it meant acknowledging she had made a catastrophic error in judgment 4 years ago. Those names represented the weak seam in Oracle's architecture. Money had moved through her system that she had not fully traced. She had believed she was managing isolated client relationships. She had actually been providing infrastructure to people who used it for things she had not asked about with sufficient rigor. The Geneva intermediary was clean enough to argue. The Cyprus structure was murky but defensible. The third name was the problem. His name was Callum Reed, and he was not in finance. He was not technically in any business that appeared in public filings or licensing records. What he was, in practical terms, was a man who moved between the spaces that legitimate structures created and found ways to use those spaces that their architects had not intended. Serena had met him through a contact she trusted. Had trusted, past tense, a distinction she was now applying retroactively with the precision of someone correcting a calculation. and had accepted his assets into Oracle's management structure after what she had believed was sufficient due diligence. The due diligence had not been sufficient. She understood that now with a clarity that was clean and terrible and useless. What she didn't understand yet, walking down the financial district sidewalk beside Greaves while he managed the litigation team, was that Callum Reed already knew she had written his name on that legal pad, and that his response to that information had been immediate, specific, and set into motion before she reached the building's front door. She found out at 2:15 in the afternoon. She was in the conference room of Greaves's firm on Lexington Avenue, a proper law office, the kind of room that communicates solidity and permanence through its furniture, which Serena was finding vaguely darkly funny given the circumstances. Working through the federal preservation documents with two members of the litigation team when her temporary phone, a clean device Greaves had provided to replace the seized one, buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. The message was 4 words and an image. The 4 words were, "We should meet. Tonight." The image was a photograph of Serena's younger sister, Clara, getting into a car outside her apartment building in Brooklyn. The photo was time-stamped 40 minutes ago. Serena looked at the photo for 3 seconds. Then she set the phone face down on the conference table and said to the attorneys, "Give me 10 minutes." She went to the women's restroom at the end of the corridor and stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists, the way her mother had taught her to do when she was a child and overwhelmed, and she looked at herself in the mirror and did something she almost never permitted herself. She let herself be afraid, fully, without management, for exactly 90 seconds. She felt the fear move through her like a current, sharp and physical, her hands unsteady against the cool porcelain, her breath doing things she had to actively correct. Then she turned the water off, straightened up. Greaves was in his office when she knocked. He was on the phone, and he looked at her face and ended the call without explanation. "Callum Reed," she said. Greaves went very still. "You know that name," she said. "I know of the name. I didn't know he was one of the Oracle clients." "He wasn't a client. I gave him infrastructure access. 4 years ago." She set the temporary phone on his desk with the message visible. "He knows I gave his name to the federal investigators." Greaves looked at the phone. His expression underwent several quick private calculations. How did he find out this fast? Someone inside Cho's team, or someone watching the building? She paused. Or someone I haven't identified yet. She looked at him directly. Is there anyone in my structure whose loyalty I should be reconsidering? Beyond Voss. Beyond Voss. Greaves held her gaze. Not to my knowledge, but my knowledge has a demonstrated gap in it today. That was honest. She gave him credit for it. I need to know where Clara is right now, Serena said. I need her somewhere I control. And I need to know everything you know about Reed. Operational, personal, whatever you have. Going to the federal investigators about a witness intimidation. Not yet. She picked up the phone. Tonight first. Information first. She looked at Greaves. He wants to meet. I'm going to meet him. Serena. He sent me a photograph of my sister getting into a car. Her voice didn't crack. It didn't do anything except continue being her voice. He's not going to escalate before the meeting. He wants something. People who want something don't damage their leverage before they've used it. She paused. I'm going to find out what he wants. Greaves looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that contains an argument being decided against. I'm coming with you, he said. No. She was already moving toward the door. You're going to get Clara and you're going to put her somewhere overnight that I approve and that nobody who knows either of our names knows about. And then you're going to pull every public record that exists on Callum Reed and have it on my phone in 2 hours. She stopped at the doorway. Can you do that? Yes, Greaves said. She left. The address came in a second message at 6 p.m. A restaurant in Tribeca that she knew by reputation, the kind of place that was expensive enough to be private and public enough to feel safe, which was a calculation she did not trust but understood the logic of. She arrived at 7:45 in a car she had arranged herself, wearing a jacket over the gray top she'd had on since 6 a.m., because she hadn't been back to anything she owned today. And she looked like a woman who had been working through an extremely difficult day, which was accurate, and she walked into the restaurant with her shoulders level and her breathing deliberate, and let the hostess lead her to the table in the back corner that had been reserved. Callum Reed was already there. He was younger than she had pictured him when she wrote his name. Early 40s, lean in the way of someone who moves a lot, with light eyes that processed the room continuously, even when he appeared to be focused elsewhere. He stood when she approached, which was a performance of courtesy, and gestured to the seat across from him, which was a performance of hospitality. And Serena sat down and looked at him directly and did not perform anything. "You look tired," he said. "I've had a long day." "You've had a role in that." "I've had a role in your day going longer than necessary." "Yes." He sat back. His voice was mid-Atlantic, the accent of someone who had spent time in several countries and shed the specifics of each. "Though I'd argue the initial choices that led to this morning were yours. You sent a photograph of my sister." "I sent a photograph to make sure you came tonight instead of hiding behind attorneys for 3 days." He said it without apology, as a logistical explanation. "I have no interest in your sister. She's irrelevant to everything I care about." "That's meant to reassure me." "It's meant to be accurate." He looked at her. "I know you gave my name to the federal investigators today. I know what that triggers. You've thought about this, you know what that triggers. And I know you're sitting here anyway, which means you calculated that meeting with me directly is better than managing the consequences of my reaction from a distance." He tilted his head slightly. "That's correct, by the way. You read the situation, right? Then tell me what you want." He didn't answer immediately. He poured water into both glasses from the carafe on the table, a domestic gesture that felt deliberate, and set it back down. "I want the Oracle infrastructure back online," he said. "Not the assets, not your money, not the holdings. The infrastructure, the pipes." He looked at her steadily. "I have transactions in process that require the movement architecture Oracle provided. The federal freeze has interrupted those transactions. I need them completed." Serena kept her face level. "The servers are under federal preservation," she said. "I know that. I also know that you retained administrative access credentials to 2 secondary nodes that were not disclosed in the preservation warrant because they don't appear in the primary documentation. Voss didn't know about them." A pause. "You're the only person who can activate those nodes." He had done his homework. The 2 secondary nodes were real. She had built them as contingency infrastructure, isolated from the main Oracle architecture, accessible only through a credential set she had never shared with anyone, not even Greaves. They were clean, entirely clean, no Moretti taint, no problematic third-party connections. And they were operational, and Callum Reed, who had apparently been paying closer attention to Oracle's architecture than she had ever realized, knew they existed. "If I activate those nodes," Serena said carefully, "I use infrastructure that is technically not under the federal order to complete transactions for a man that federal investigators are now aware of as a person of interest in my cooperation agreement. That exposes me to obstruction charges. Only if anyone finds out. Federal investigators tend to find out. They tend to find out about the things they're looking for," Reed said. "They're not looking for 2 secondary nodes that Voss couldn't tell them about." He leaned forward slightly. "Serena, I don't want to be your enemy. I don't want to be your problem. I want 2 days of infrastructure access, and then I disappear from your life, and you never hear my name again, and when your attorneys argue the taint separation case in front of a federal judge, I am not a complicating factor. And if I don't?" His eyes were very still. "Then I become a very significant complicating factor," he said. "Not through violence. Violence is expensive and loud, and I avoid it as a policy." He said it the way someone says they avoid gluten. A preference, casually held. "But I have information about Oracle's 3rd and 4th year of operation that your cooperation agreement did not cover. Information that, if it reached the federal investigators through a different channel, would reframe your entire asset separation argument." He picked up his water glass. "You'd lose everything you built. Oracle's holdings, the legitimate fortune, all of it subject to forfeiture." He took a drink. "I don't want that outcome. It's wasteful, but I'll produce it if I need to." The restaurant moved quietly around them. Other tables, other people, the soft sounds of ordinary evening. Serena looked at Callum Reed across the white tablecloth and did the calculation. And the calculation was genuinely hard in a way that most calculations were not, because both paths were bad, and the difference between them was a question of which kind of bad she could survive. Activate the nodes. Potential obstruction exposure. Dependency on Reedy's word that he would disappear. Violation of the spirit, if not the letter of her cooperation agreement. A choice that made her something she had spent considerable effort not becoming. Refuse. Reed delivers whatever he had to federal investigators. The asset separation argument collapses. 7 years of Oracle's core holdings are subject to federal forfeiture. And she emerges from all of this with exactly what Dante had always implied she had, nothing of her own. She breathed. In through the nose, count of 4. She had done this in 100 difficult rooms. She thought about Clara. She thought about the photograph. She thought about Greaves pulling records for 2 hours and what those records had told her, that Reed was methodical and patient and kept his word when keeping it was strategically sound, and broke it only when breaking it cost him less than the alternative. She thought about what she had told Dante that morning in the server room. I'm explaining it. There's a difference. Then she thought about something else, something she had built into Oracle's architecture in the first year, before Elena Voss joined, before any of the third-party access. In the very foundation of the system, when she was alone with the design and could put into it whatever she chose. Something she had never told anyone about. Not Greaves, not V, not Elena Voss. A kill function. Kill. Not for the assets. For the infrastructure itself. A sequence she could execute remotely that would render every Oracle node, primary, secondary, all of it, permanently inaccessible. Not just frozen. Gone. The digital equivalent of burning a building to the ground, leaving nothing for anyone to use, including herself. She had built it because she was the kind of person who builds exits before she builds entrances. She had never imagined using it like this. Had imagined it as protection against a different kind of threat. Dante finding Oracle, federal seizure before she was ready, a hostile takeover of the infrastructure. Not this. But the logic held. If she executed the kill function, Reed got nothing. The nodes he wanted ceased to exist. His leverage, the infrastructure access he needed, vanished. Whatever additional information he had about Oracle's operation became less damaging without the infrastructure to corroborate it, less useful to federal investigators who were working from Voss's testimony and would find it harder to build a coherent case around a system that no longer technically existed. She would also lose the secondary nodes herself, permanently, which meant losing the last clean piece of Oracle's operational architecture, losing the technical argument that the secondary nodes were uncontaminated and therefore not subject to the federal freeze. She would be destroying her own best evidence of clean separation. She would be giving up the last strong card in her hand to make sure Reed couldn't play his. The math was brutal. Losing that argument made the asset separation case harder. Harder, not impossible. But harder meant longer, meant more expensive, meant outcomes she couldn't fully predict. She looked at Reed. He was waiting, patient, the patience of someone who believes he holds the stronger position. She thought, he believes that because he's only seen the board as it currently exists. He hasn't seen what she's willing to do to the board itself. I need 24 hours, she said. Reed studied her. For what? To consult with my attorneys about the obstruction exposure. If I'm going to do this, I need to understand the legal risk precisely. He was quiet for a moment. 12 hours. 24, or we end this conversation now and I take my chances with whatever you give the investigators. She held his gaze. I've been building things for 7 years. I can rebuild from less than you think. The statement landed. She saw it land, saw the small adjustment in his eyes, the brief recalculation, and she knew he was doing what everyone did when confronted with a person who claims not to fear the worst outcome, which was trying to determine whether the claim was a performance or the truth. In this case, it was both. He nodded. 24 hours, he said. You'll hear from me at 8 tomorrow morning. Have an answer. Serena stood, and she picked up her jacket from the back of the chair, and she walked out of the restaurant without looking back and stood on the Tribeca sidewalk in the October cold with her heart hitting her ribcage at a rate she could feel in her temples and her hands completely steady, because her hands were almost always steady. It was one of the things she had trained in herself so long ago, it had become structural, and she pulled out the temporary phone and called Greaves. He answered on the first ring. Clara's safe, he said immediately. She's at a location I control. She doesn't know why. Good. Serena started walking. I need you to find me something. The kill function in Oracle's base architecture. I need to know if executing it while the servers are under federal preservation constitutes destruction of evidence. A long pause. You built a kill function. Yes. And you're considering, just answer the question. She heard him breathing, heard the rapid intake of someone doing fast legal analysis in real time. If the servers under preservation are the primary nodes, he said slowly, and the kill function affects secondary infrastructure not named in the preservation order, technically, the preservation order only covers what's named. Secondary nodes that aren't in the warrant aren't covered assets. So executing the kill function on the secondary nodes only would be legally, arguably, within bounds. He paused. Serena, what did Reed say to you? I'll tell you everything tomorrow. She was walking fast now, the cold air sharp against her face. Right now I need you to do one more thing. What? I need you to pull the federal preservation warrant again and confirm for me precisely that the secondary nodes are not named. I need to be certain. I can confirm that in 20 minutes. Do it. She ended the call and walked another half block and stopped at the corner and stood under a streetlight with the city moving around her and took one more deliberate breath and looked up at the Manhattan skyline, all that dark and glittering altitude, and thought about what she was about to do. She was going to burn the last clean piece of what she'd built. She was going to do it deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost, because the alternative was handing Callum Reed a lever he would use against her for as long as it served him. And Serena Vale had spent 12 years allowing someone to hold a lever over her, and she was not, under any circumstances, doing that. She executed the kill function at 11:47 p.m. She did it from the back seat of a car parked on a quiet street in Lower Manhattan, using a 12-digit credential sequence she had memorized 4 years ago and never written down anywhere, entered into a secondary access terminal on the temporary phone that Greaves had spent 40 minutes confirming was not covered by the federal preservation order. The execution took 9 seconds. She watched the confirmation screen and then the screen went blank. And that was that. The secondary nodes, the last clean architecture of everything she had built, reduced to unrecoverable nothing in less time than it took to make coffee. She sat with the blank screen for a moment. Then she put the phone in her jacket pocket and told the driver to take her to Greaves's office. She didn't feel what she expected to feel, which was loss. She felt something quieter and more specific, the sensation of a debt being settled. Not a good debt, not the kind you feel relief about. The kind where settling it costs you something real and the settlement is still correct. She had burned the last strong card in her hand to deny Reed the leverage he needed, and she had done it clearly, without flinching, and she was going to live with the cost of it and rebuild from whatever was left. That was the job now, whatever was left. Greaves was at his desk when she arrived, jacket off, sleeves rolled, the look of a man who had been working continuously since 5 in the morning and had made peace with the fact that the night wasn't ending. He had 2 associates with him, young, quiet, competent, and a spread of documents across the conference table that represented the current state of things. He looked at her face when she walked in, and he didn't ask about the kill function. He knew. "Tell me where we are," she said. He told her. The Oracle primary holdings, the accumulated 7 years of wealth, the legitimate fortune, were frozen but not seized. The federal preservation order was a holding action, not a judgment. Cho's cooperation agreement was structured around Serena providing the third-party names and access records in exchange for the federal investigators prioritizing the taint separation argument. With Voss's testimony, the government had a version of Oracle that looked, from a certain angle, like deliberate criminal structuring. With Serena's cooperation and documentation, there was a competing version, equally supported by the actual records, that looked like a sophisticated, legitimate financial system that had been partially compromised by bad third-party actors without Serena's full knowledge. Both versions were arguable. Which version the federal investigators chose to pursue depended on the value of Serena's cooperation relative to the value of dismantling Oracle as a criminal asset. "What did Cho say?" Serena asked. "She's reviewing the third-party names. The Geneva intermediary is cooperating with a separate European investigation. That's useful to her. The Cyprus structure is connected to 2 ongoing cases that are providing documentation advances materially." Greaves picked up a page. "Reed is the complication. She wants more than a name. She wants operational detail." "What kind of operational detail?" "How we use the infrastructure. Transaction sequences, counterparties, destinations." He set the page down. "What she actually wants to know is whether Reed is a principal or a conduit, whether what moved through Oracle was his or someone else's." Serena sat down at the conference table. She was very tired. The specific tiredness of a day that had started before dawn and dismantled most of what she owned and required her to make 3 decisions she couldn't take back. And she was sitting in a law office at midnight, looking at documents. And she was, by any reasonable measure, in a worse position than she had been 24 hours ago. She was also alive, intact, functional. She thought about what she knew about Reed that she hadn't put in her cooperation agreement. Not because she was protecting him, she owed him nothing, less than nothing, but because she hadn't been asked the right question yet. She knew what he had moved through Oracle. She had the transaction records in her memory with the precision she applied to everything she committed to memory. She hadn't provided them to Cho because Cho had asked for names and Serena had given names, and the additional detail was information she had been holding as a secondary resource. She looked at Greaves. If I give Cho the full transaction records for Reed's Oracle usage, counterparties, sequences, destination accounts, what does that do to my cooperation agreement? Greaves blinked. You have those. I have them. You didn't. He stopped. Recalibrated. Looked at her with the expression of a man who has worked alongside someone for a long time and is still occasionally surprised by the depth of the filing cabinet. If you provide full transaction records, the cooperation value increases substantially. Cho gets operational detail on a subject she's clearly been trying to build a case around. In exchange, the government's interest in arguing Oracle as a criminal asset becomes significantly less valuable than using Serena Vale as an ongoing cooperation resource. He paused. The freeze on Oracle's primary holdings becomes very hard to justify if you're actively helping them build cases. That's what I thought, Serena said. When can you document those records? Give me 2 hours and a clean laptop. Greaves gave her both. She worked until 3 in the morning. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, without shortcuts, building the documentation from memory with a precision that she occasionally found strange about herself. This capacity for holding financial architecture in her head like spatial geometry, every transaction a coordinate in a 3-dimensional structure she could navigate with her eyes closed. She built the record of Reed's Oracle usage across 14 months of access, every counterparty, every destination, every sequence. When she was finished, it was 41 pages of documented transaction history that would tell a federal financial crimes investigator exactly what Callum Reed had been doing with her infrastructure and who he had been doing it for. She sent it to Greaves at 3:18 a.m. and told him to get it to Cho first thing in the morning. Then she went to the small couch in the corner of Greaves's office and lay down with her jacket over her and closed her eyes and slept for 3 hours, which was not enough and was what was available. She was awake when Reed's call came in at 8 the next morning. She let it ring twice. Then she answered. You've had your 24 hours, he said. I have, she said. The answer is no. A silence. Long enough to be a real silence, not a performance. I'd think carefully. I executed the kill function on the secondary nodes at 11:47 last night, she said. They don't exist anymore. There's nothing for you to access and nothing for me to provide. She kept her voice even, the way she always kept her voice. And I provided full transaction documentation of your Oracle usage to the federal investigators approximately 5 hours ago. Counterparties, sequences, destinations, everything. She paused. Whatever you were planning to give them about Oracle's operation, they now have a considerably more detailed picture from me. So the value of your information as leverage is somewhat reduced. Another silence. Different quality to this one. You burned your own infrastructure, he said. Yes. That was the last clean asset you had. It was. She heard him breathing, the flat, thinking breath of someone recalculating rapidly. Why? He said. And the why was genuine. Not a challenge, not a threat, actually genuine. The question of a man who operates on the logic of preservation and profit and cannot fully compute a decision that sacrifices both. Serena thought about how to answer that honestly. Because you were going to own me, she said. 2 days of infrastructure access, then you disappear, then 6 months later something else comes up, and you have another request and another photograph, and I spend the rest of my life managing your leverage instead of building anything. She let that settle. I've already lived that arrangement with a different person for 12 years. I'm not doing it again. The line was quiet for a long moment. Then Reed said, with something that sounded almost like reluctant respect, You're going to have a very hard year, probably. The Oracle assets, the freeze, the litigation. Yes. And you did this anyway. I did. He said nothing for another moment. Then, for what it's worth, the information I had about Oracle's third and fourth year, I'm going to be considerably less interested in sharing it, given that you've apparently already provided the investigators with something more comprehensive. A pause. It costs me nothing to let that go. I know, Serena said. That's part of why I did it. He ended the call. She sat with the dead phone and felt, for the first time in 36 hours, something that was adjacent to relief. Not clean relief. The relief of a person who has made it through something difficult and is now in the early, exhausted phase of understanding what it cost. She thought about Clara. She called Greaves and told him Clara could go home. She called Clara herself, got voicemail, left a message that said only that she was fine and she'd explain everything soon, and she was sorry for the disruption, and the word sorry felt inadequate and was also the only available word, so she used it. Then she sat and thought about what was left. What was left was this: a federal cooperation agreement that had, over the past 12 hours, become substantially more valuable to the investigators than it had been when she signed it. A freeze on Oracle's primary holdings that Greaves believed could be challenged with increasing effectiveness over the coming weeks. An asset separation argument that was still difficult but no longer required the secondary nodes to succeed, because the full transaction documentation she had provided gave the investigators a different and more useful frame, not Oracle as a criminal structure, but Oracle as a compromised legitimate structure, its creator a cooperating witness whose transparency was actively advancing multiple federal cases. There was also the Moretti side of things, which was separate and ongoing and not her responsibility, except in the ways it inevitably intersected with what she had owned and what she had structured and what she had now partially provided to federal investigators in the context of explaining her own position. Dante's attorneys had called Greaves twice in the past 24 hours. She had not spoken to Dante. She did, 3 days later. Not by choice, exactly. By the logic of loose ends, which are the things that remain after the main structure comes down and require their own separate resolution. He called Greaves's office line at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday and asked if Serena would take the call. And Serena was sitting at the conference table working through discovery documents, and Greaves held the receiver toward her with an expression that communicated the decision was entirely hers. She took it. "I'm not going to ask what you gave them," Dante said immediately. The voice was recognizable. Same register, same cadence, but stripped of something. The performance of ease was gone. What was left was just a voice. "That's not why I'm calling." "Why are you calling?" A pause. "My attorneys say the Moretti Group can survive restructuring," he said. "The criminal investigation is focused on specific personnel and specific transactions. The business entities themselves, the legitimate ones, are viable if they're separated from the liability." A pause. "The entities that are viable are the ones you structured." "I know that. They want to propose a management transition, bring in outside leadership, clean the board, reposition the legitimate holdings." Another pause, longer. "They say the fastest path to stability involves your sign-off on several of the ownership structures, because your signature is on the original documents." Serena looked at the wall across from her. This was not what she had planned. She had not planned to be, in any residual sense, connected to the Moretti Group after Protocol Icarus. She had planned a clean severance, but clean severance had met the real world, which had Greaves and federal investigators and Elena Voss and Callum Reed in it, and what remained was not a clean anything. It was a complicated tangle of legal and structural reality that required, apparently, her involvement to resolve correctly. "What specifically do they need?" she said. Dante told her. It was precise and operational, the way he talked when he wasn't performing. This was why she had found him compelling once. This capacity for clarity when he dropped the showmanship. The attorneys needed 3 signatures on transition documents, standard legal language. Her involvement would be disclosed, which meant it would become part of the record, which meant she was permanently attached to the resolution of a criminal organization's legitimate restructuring. She thought about how that looked. Then she thought about how it actually was, which was different from how it looked, and she had spent enough of her life managing appearance over reality to know which one she needed to choose now. "I'll sign," she said. Have the documents sent to Greaves. Silence on the line. Then Dante said, "Why?" She almost smiled. The same question Reed had asked. Why, in different mouths with different stakes underneath it? Because those businesses employ 2,000 people who didn't make the decisions that are being investigated, she said. And because it's the right thing, and because I built those structures correctly, and I'd rather they survive correctly than collapse because I was unwilling to spend an afternoon signing papers. She paused. And because it closes this chapter, completely. I want it closed. Dante was quiet for a long moment. You always did see further than me, he said. She didn't respond to that. It was true, and it was also 12 years too late, and there was nothing useful left to say about it. The charity case comment, she said instead. On Harlan Becker. I know. Did you believe it? When you said it? A long silence. The honest kind. I believed it more than I should have, Dante said, and less than it sounded. Another pause. I think I knew, somewhere, what you actually were, and it was easier to make you smaller than to reckon with it. Serena sat with that for a moment, not because it was the apology she had wanted. It wasn't. It was too qualified and too late for that, but because it was honest, and honesty from Dante Moretti was something she had stopped expecting so long ago, that receiving it now had a strange, final quality. Like the last piece of furniture being moved out of a room you no longer live in. Goodbye, Dante, she said. Goodbye, Serena. She handed the receiver back to Greaves and picked up the discovery document she had been working through and found her place and kept working. The Oracle freeze was lifted partially 4 months later, following Serena's testimony in a federal proceeding that she gave clearly and without embellishment for 6 hours in a windowless room in Lower Manhattan, and following the formal cooperation agreement that her attorneys had spent those 4 months negotiating into something that Greaves described as, given the circumstances, unexpectedly solid. The primary holdings were released in stages, not all of them, not immediately, not without legal fees that made her briefly furious at the pure administrative cost of existing, but enough to reestablish, enough to begin again. Elena Voss's testimony, it turned out, had been less comprehensive than Cho initially suggested. Elena had provided structural information about Oracle's architecture and had reframed the seed capital question in the way Serena had feared, but she had not, because she didn't have it, the full picture of the third-party contamination or the transaction records that Serena herself had provided. The government's case against Oracle as a criminal asset required both pieces, and with Serena's cooperation filling in the second piece on her own terms, the framing shifted. Elena's cooperation became less valuable. She received a lesser deal than she had been promised. Serena did not feel satisfaction about that. She felt the particular absence of satisfaction that comes from being beyond the point where other people's punishments mean anything. She moved out of anything connected to the Moretti name in January. A smaller apartment in the West Village. She had been offered things larger, more expensive, from the recovering Oracle assets, and she chose the smaller one deliberately. She was not performing austerity. She simply found that she wanted less around her than she had carried for the past 12 years. And the smaller apartment with its 3 good rooms and its south-facing windows and the noise of the street below felt, in a way that surprised her, like something she had chosen rather than something she'd been assigned. She hired 5 people. Not the sprawling operational structure of the Oracle years. 5 people she had vetted personally, whose competence she trusted and whose loyalty she understood to be professional rather than personal, which was the only kind of loyalty she was interested in now. She registered a new entity, clean, simple, no layers, no architecture designed to obscure, and she called it what it was, which was a financial advisory firm with her name on the door. Her name. Not Val Moretti, just Vale. Serena Vale and Associates opened on a Thursday in February to no particular fanfare, which was how she wanted it. She had one client on opening day, a technology company whose CFO had been referred to her by someone she respected. She did the work herself, sat with the numbers, understood the structure, advised clearly and specifically, and the CFO, a practical woman who had been burned by sophisticated-sounding nonsense before, told her afterward that it was the clearest financial picture anyone had given her in 3 years. Serena said thank you. She meant it. Marcus Hale came to see her in March. She hadn't expected that. hadn't expected anything from that world, had sealed it in her mind with the same completeness she applied to structures she had finished working on. But he called Greaves, and Greaves relayed the request, and she thought about it for a day and said yes. He sat in her new office, which smelled like fresh paint and coffee, and had none of the weight of the old places, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the server room that morning, the look of someone still updating their model. "He's in Florida," Marcus said. "Dante, his sister has a house. He's not fighting it. The criminal investigation. His attorneys are cooperating on the specific charges and the rest of it is being restructured." He paused. "I thought you should know he's not in danger. From that direction." "I didn't think he was," Serena said. "Dante knows how to survive. He's always known that." Marcus nodded. He looked at his hands. He had the look of a man who has spent 20 years in a structure that has now dissolved and is genuinely uncertain what he is outside of it. "What are you doing now?" Serena asked. He looked up. "I don't know yet." She looked at him for a moment. Marcus Hale, for all the ways he had served a system she had dismantled, had been competent and honest in his own way, had operated according to his own code even when that code kept him loyal to the wrong principle. She had known him for a decade and had never trusted him fully and had also never found him dishonest. "I have a client," she said, "who needs an operational logistics advisor. The kind of work you're good at. It's legitimate, fully, completely, nothing attached to it that you'd need to manage." She looked at him steadily. "It would be a different kind of work than you're used to." "Smaller," he said. "Cleaner." He sat with that for a moment. "Send me the details," he said. She did. He took the work. In April, Greaves concluded the last of the Oracle litigation with a settlement that preserved 63% of the primary holdings. Not everything, not close to everything. But 63% of what Serena Vale had built independently over 7 years was a number that, when she sat with it honestly, she could work with. She had worked with less. She had started with nothing, which was what Dante had said on television, and this was the complexity she had stopped trying to resolve into something simple, not entirely untrue. She had started with nothing except the thing that turned out to be the only thing that mattered, which was the capacity to see structures clearly and build them patiently and understand that the most important work is usually invisible until it's the only thing left standing. She sat in her office one evening in late April, after the associates had gone home, with the settlement documents on her desk and the south-facing windows going dark above the West Village streetlights coming up, and she thought about what 12 years had cost and what they had produced and whether the accounting made sense. It didn't make sense, exactly. That was the honest conclusion. The accounting of a life that moves through love and ambition and betrayal and rebuilding doesn't resolve into sense. It resolves into something more ragged and more real, a tally that includes things you can't assign value to. Time spent performing smallness, moments of genuine connection mixed into years of transactional coexistence, the particular education of understanding yourself completely only after you've made every possible mistake about who you were. She had spent 12 years being a foundation, invisible, load-bearing, essential, and unacknowledged. She had spent 3 years building an exit. She had spent one catastrophic day watching the exit partially collapse, and she had spent the months since then doing what she had always done, which was look clearly at what was actually there and build carefully from it, without sentimentality, without the comfort of a clean narrative, with only the practical honesty of a person who knows that the work is the thing and the work is always available. She picked up the settlement documents and filed them in the cabinet behind her desk. Then she opened her laptop and started on the client analysis she had promised for Friday. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary evening. 10,000 private emergencies, 10,000 small reckonings, the vast, indifferent machinery of other people's lives continuing with or without her involvement. She had loved this city once with the love of someone who had arrived in it with nothing and found it thrillingly indifferent to her origins. She still loved it, differently. The way you love something after you have stopped needing it to save you. She worked until 9. She turned off the light. She walked home through the West Village streets in the cool April dark, hands in her pockets. No driver, no escort, no performance of any kind. Just a woman walking home after a long day, which was all she was. Which was also, she had come to understand, enough. Not a cautionary tale. Not a legend. Not a charity case and not an untouchable and not the quiet architect of anyone's empire but her own. Just Serena Vale. Walking home. Starting again. The city held her the way cities hold everyone, indiscriminately, without preference, making no promises. She didn't need promises anymore. She had built enough to know that the only architecture worth trusting is the kind you construct yourself, stone by stone, with your own hands, and maintain with your own judgment, and are willing, when the moment requires it, to burn down completely rather than let someone else own the match. That was the lesson. It wasn't clean. It wasn't the lesson she would have chosen if lessons came with choices. But it was hers, and she had paid for it completely, and she carried it forward into the April night like something that had cost everything and was therefore, in the only way that mattered, worth exactly that.